Fletcher had been teaching Interspecies Conflict Resolution 101 for 3 years now, and he'd learned exactly one useful thing. Never volunteer for your own demonstrations. Unfortunately, the Academy's budget had been cut again, which meant no teaching assistant, which meant he was the only warm body available when someone needed to show the class how to escape a wrist grab. "All right," he said, standing in the center of classroom 7B with his arms hanging at his sides. The holographic display board behind him showed a frozen image of 2 figures in the middle of a peaceful disagreement. Outside the large windows, the space station's docking ring rotated slowly against a backdrop of stars. The key principle here is de-escalation. You want to signal non-aggression while creating space to... A hand shot up. Well, a furred arm. Krelvor, the Valorkai student in the back row, had both his large amber eyes fixed on Fletcher with an intensity that suggested he'd missed the non-aggression part entirely. Fletcher sighed. "Yes, Krelvor?" "This technique," Krelvor said, his bronze fur rippling as he gestured with one clawed hand. His thick, ringed tail twitched behind him. "It assumes the opponent releases willingly. What if they maintain grip strength?" "Then you've failed at the de-escalation part," Fletcher said, "which is the actual point of the... May I demonstrate a counter-scenario?" Krelvor was already standing, all 7.5 feet of him unfolding from a desk that had been slightly too small to begin with. The 3 parallel ridges on his skull caught the overhead lighting as he moved toward the front of the room. Fletcher glanced at the clock. Still 40 minutes left in the period. He looked at the rest of the class, a mix of species, most of whom were watching with the kind of polite disinterest that suggested they were mentally already at lunch. Except for one student. Tamsin, the human exchange student, sat in the 3rd row with perfect posture and the same neutral expression she'd worn every single day for the past 2 months. She never spoke, never raised her hand, never even blinked more than absolutely necessary. It was deeply unsettling, but she turned in her assignments on time, so Fletcher had learned not to think about it too hard. "Fine," he said, waving Krelvor forward. "But remember, we're demonstrating de-escalation, not..." Krelvor grabbed his wrist. Not aggressively, exactly, but with the kind of firm confidence that suggested he'd done this before in contexts that didn't involve classroom demonstrations. His grip was warm through the fur, and Fletcher could feel the careful control in it. Valorkai were warrior caste by tradition. This kid probably knew 17 ways to break someone's arm. "Okay," Fletcher said, very aware that he was now the visual aid. "So the first step is to..." He'd meant to walk through the standard release technique. Step into the grab, rotate the arm, create leverage. Basic stuff. But Krelvor's grip shifted slightly, adjusting for Fletcher's movement before he'd even finished the thought, and Fletcher's hand bumped against his own pocket, where the training knife was. The rubber one he'd grabbed from the supply cabinet that morning, because he'd planned to demonstrate basic blade awareness in the second half of class. His fingers closed around it automatically, muscle memory from 100 other demonstrations. He pulled it out, holding it loosely, completely forgetting for one crucial moment that he was still in Krelvor's grip and that producing a weapon, even a harmless rubber one, while in close contact, might send a different message than "observe my excellent teaching methodology." The classroom went very quiet. Krelvor's fur rippled, started at his shoulders and spread outward like a wave, the bronze color bleeding into orange and then into a deep, alarming crimson. His pupils dilated until they were nearly circular. His tail went rigid, then started lashing back and forth hard enough to knock over the chair he'd been sitting in. "Oh," Fletcher said, looking down at the rubber knife in his hand. "No, this is just—" That's when he heard it. A sound he'd never heard before in his entire teaching career. A sound he would have been perfectly happy never hearing. Tamsin was smiling. He looked over at her, still frozen in Krelvor's grip, which had somehow gotten much tighter. And yes, that was definitely a smile. Small, controlled. The kind of expression that said she'd just seen something deeply, personally entertaining. Her eyes hadn't changed at all. Still calm, still neutral. Just the smile, like someone had photoshopped it onto her face as an afterthought. Krelvor made a sound halfway between a growl and a whimper, his ears flattened completely against his skull. "You," he started, his voice coming out strained. "You issue challenge. Here? In learning space?" "What?" "No." Fletcher tried to pull his wrist free and discovered that Krelvor's grip had gone from firm demonstration to panic clench. "It's rubber. Look, it's—" He squeezed the knife to show how flexible it was. This did not have the calming effect he'd hoped for. Krelvor's fur was now entirely crimson, and the color was spreading down his arms. His tail took out another chair. "The Deathworlder," Krelvor said, and his voice cracked slightly. "She approves." Fletcher looked back at Tamsin. The smile was gone now, but she was leaning forward slightly in her seat, watching with the kind of focused attention she'd never once given to his actual lectures. "She's just—" Fletcher started, but he had no idea how to finish that sentence. Just what? Just interested in interpersonal conflict? Just happy to see her teacher accidentally threaten a student? Just demonstrating the kind of behavioral red flags that should probably have been caught during the application process. The other students were moving. Not in a panicked way, but with the kind of smooth, practiced efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. Desks scraped, bags were grabbed. The door to the corridor slid open, and the entire class filed out in under 30 seconds, leaving Fletcher alone with Krelvor and Tamsin. "Wait," Fletcher called after them. This is still class time. You can't just—" The door slid shut. Krelvor released Fletcher's wrist and backed up 3 steps, his ringed tail sweeping across the floor. His bronze fur was still flushed crimson across his shoulders and back. "I did not mean offense," he said, his voice formal and stiff. "I did not know you carried ancestral blade bond with the Deathworlder. This changes context of demonstration." "I don't— What?" Fletcher looked at the rubber knife, then at Tamsin, then back at Krelvor. "This is a training aid. It costs 8 credits. I have 15 of them in my desk. You show readiness to her," Krelvor continued, as if Fletcher hadn't spoken. His pupils were still wide, and he kept glancing at Tamsin like she might suddenly lunge across the desks. "She shows pleasure. This is pair bonding ritual, yes? Combat marriage?" "No," Fletcher said, louder than he'd intended. "Nobody's marrying anybody. This is a classroom." "Was classroom," Krelvor corrected, gesturing at the empty desks with one furred hand. "Now is ritual space." Fletcher pinched the bridge of his nose. He'd had difficult classes before. He'd had students who didn't understand the material. He'd even had one memorable semester where a glimmering had gotten stuck in photosynthesis mode and spent 6 weeks essentially being a houseplant in the corner. But he'd never had a student evacuate the room because of a rubber knife and a smile. He looked at Tamsin. She was still sitting calmly in her seat, hands folded on the desk in front of her, expression back to its usual neutral mask. "Tamsin," Fletcher said, trying to sound like a reasonable authority figure, and not someone who just accidentally triggered an interspecies incident. "Do you want to explain to Krelvor that this is all a misunderstanding?" She tilted her head slightly, considering. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and measured, the first words he'd heard from her all semester. "You demonstrated adequate grip check awareness. Response time was acceptable. That's not..." Fletcher started, then stopped. "Response time for what?" "Blade deployment under restraint," Tamsin said, as if this was obvious. "Standard retention scenario, though the training knife limits practical application." Krelvor made a sound like a tea kettle. His fur rippled from crimson back to orange, then immediately back to crimson. "It's not a retention scenario," Fletcher said, hearing his voice climb slightly. "It's a classroom demonstration that went wrong because I forgot what was in my pocket. Tactical awareness requires constant inventory," Tamsin said. She was still using that same calm, educational tone. "Forgetting pocket contents represents critical failure point." "I'm a teacher," Fletcher said. "Not a tactical anything." "You drew while gripped," Tamsin pointed out. "That's intermediate level response." "It was an accident." Tamsin's expression didn't change. "Accidents with weapons indicate inadequate training or excellent instinct. You don't move like inadequate training." Fletcher stared at her. He moved like someone who'd done 4 years of mandatory civil service in a logistics office and then gotten a teaching certification because the pay was slightly better than data entry. He moved like someone whose biggest physical challenge this month had been carrying 3 boxes of data tablets from the supply room. "I think," he said slowly, "that there's been a significant cultural miscommunication." "Yes," Krelvor agreed immediately, his tail still lashing. "I did not know humans could move like that. You are from Deathworld?" "I'm from New Manitoba Station," Fletcher said. "We're famous for our hockey teams and grain processing. Nobody's dying there except from boredom." Tamsin made a small sound. It might have been a laugh, but it was so quiet and brief that Fletcher couldn't be sure. When he looked at her, she was already standing, picking up her bag with easy efficiency. "Where are you going?" Fletcher asked. "Class isn't over." "Class evacuated," Tamsin said, moving toward the front of the room with smooth, measured steps. Nothing rushed, but Fletcher had the distinct impression she could move much faster if she wanted to. Continuing instruction with only 2 students represents resource inefficiency. She stopped a few feet away, still in that unsettling, perfect posture. Up close, he could see that her academy uniform fit slightly wrong. Not too small or too large, but like she wasn't used to clothing that didn't serve a specific tactical purpose. "However," she said, and there it was again, that small, controlled smile. "If you're continuing the demonstration, I'd like to volunteer." Krelvor's fur flashed crimson so fast it looked like he'd been set on fire. "No," Fletcher said immediately. "Absolutely not. Demonstration's over. Everyone passes. Class dismissed." "Class already dismissed itself," Tamsin said, "and you still have the knife." Fletcher looked down. He was, in fact, still holding the rubber training knife. He'd forgotten about it again. He very carefully set it down on the nearest desk. "There," he said. "No knife. No demonstration. No..." He gestured vaguely at the space between them. "Whatever you think this is." "Pity," Tamsin said. She didn't sound disappointed exactly. More like she was filing away an interesting data point for later. The grip escape technique you were teaching is inefficient against opponents with higher strength ratios. I could show you the revision we learned in basic conditioning. Basic conditioning for what? Fletcher asked, then immediately held up one hand. Actually, don't answer that. I don't want to know. Survival standards, Tamsin said anyway. Earth. Mandatory before off-world travel permits. Krelvor made that tea kettle sound again. His ears flattened so hard against his skull, they nearly disappeared into his fur. Earth is Class 12, he said, like he was reminding himself of a crucial fact. Class 12. I read file. I knew this. Why did I volunteer? He turned and walked straight into a desk. It scraped across the floor with a metallic screech. Krelvor adjusted course, made it to the door, and jabbed at the control panel with one furred hand. The door slid open, and he disappeared into the corridor, his tail trailing behind him like a bottle brush. The door closed. Fletcher and Tamsin stood in the empty classroom. The holographic display board was still showing the frozen image of two figures having a peaceful disagreement, completely oblivious to the fact that Fletcher's actual demonstration had gone so catastrophically wrong that his entire class had evacuated like the room was decompressing. So, Fletcher said eventually. Earth. Yes, Tamsin confirmed. Class 12 Deathworld. Correct. Fletcher had taught a lot of students from a lot of places, but he'd never actually had someone from a Class 12 before. He knew they existed, everyone knew they existed, but they were rare enough that most people went their entire lives without meeting one. Class 12 meant the kind of planet where everything was actively trying to kill you, and evolution had responded by making the dominant species exceptionally good at not dying. It explained a lot about Tamsin, actually. The stillness, the watching, the way she never seemed surprised by anything. It did not explain why she'd smiled when he'd accidentally pulled a knife. Tamsin, he said carefully. When I pulled out that training knife, why did you smile? She considered the question with the same focused attention she'd given to Krelvor's reaction. You demonstrated practical response under constraint, she said finally. Most instructors don't. It was refreshing. It was an accident, Fletcher said again, with the kind of emphasis that suggested he might need to start wearing a sign. Yes, Tamsin agreed. That's what made it practical. Fletcher looked at the rubber knife on the desk, then at the door where his entire class had fled, then at Tamsin, who was still standing there with her perfect posture and her unsettling calm. I think, he said slowly, that I need to talk to the administrator about classroom protocols. Probably wise, Tamsin said. She picked up the rubber knife, tested its weight with casual efficiency, and handed it back to him, handle first. Though if you want to continue the blade awareness section next class, I'd still be willing to assist with demonstration. No, Fletcher said. I'm quite good at it. I believe you, Fletcher said. That's why the answer is no. Tamsin's smile flickered back for just a moment. Understood, instructor. She walked to the door, paused, and looked back. For what it's worth, the grip escape technique you were teaching is fine for species with comparable physiology. The weakness only appears against opponents with significant strength or size advantage. Most situations won't require the revision. Good to know, Fletcher said weakly. But if you ever want to learn it, Tamsin added, I'm in the gym most evenings, slot 7C. Then she was gone, and Fletcher was alone in his empty classroom with a rubber knife and the growing suspicion that he'd just survived something that should probably have a formal incident report. He looked at the clock. Still 23 minutes left in the period. This was, he decided, a perfect time to take an early lunch. He was halfway to the door when it slid open again, and Tamsin stuck her head back in. "Next class session," she said. "If you need a volunteer for any demonstrations—" "No," Fletcher said. "I'm in the front row." "Absolutely not." "Just wanted to make sure you knew," Tamsin said cheerfully, and disappeared again. Fletcher stood very still for a long moment. Then he walked over to his desk, pulled out the emergency contact information for the Academy's Cultural Liaison Office, and started composing a message that began with, "I may have accidentally triggered a Valorkai combat response," and got significantly more complicated from there. Outside the windows, the station continued its slow rotation. Inside classroom 7B, Fletcher looked at the rubber training knife in his hand and very carefully placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, under a stack of ungraded assignments where it couldn't accidentally threaten anyone. His teaching evaluation was coming up next month. He was really hoping this didn't make it into the comments section. Fletcher made it to the Academy Administrator's office in under 10 minutes, which was impressive considering he had to navigate 3 sections of corridor and avoid making eye contact with any of his former students, who were clustered in small groups and definitely talking about him. The administrator's office was cramped, filled with data tablets stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. A harried-looking Krellian administrator sat behind the desk, their eye stalks swiveling to track Fletcher as he entered. "Let me guess," the administrator said before Fletcher could speak. "Classroom 7B, the Valorkai student, the human exchange student from Earth." They pulled up a screen with one tentacle. "I've already gotten 16 incident notifications and a request for trauma counseling." 16, Fletcher said. There were only 20 students in that class. 4 of them filed twice, the administrator said wearily. "So, what happened?" Fletcher explained. "The demonstration, the training knife, Krelvor's reaction, Tamsin's smile, the evacuation." As he talked, he watched the administrator's eye stalks droop lower and lower until they were nearly resting on the desk. "You pulled a weapon," the administrator said slowly, "in front of a Class 12 Deathworlder." "A training weapon," Fletcher corrected. "Rubber, completely harmless." And she smiled. "Yes, but—" "Instructor Fletcher," the administrator said, and there was something almost sympathetic in their tone. "Did you read the student files when the exchange program started?" Fletcher had absolutely read the files. He read all his student files. "Yes," he said. "Did you read Tamsin's?" Fletcher thought back, tried to remember specifics. Human, Earth, exchange program, good grades, no behavioral incidents. He paused. It was actually a very boring file. "Yes," the administrator said. "Deliberately boring. Do you know what we have to do to get clearance for a class MOM? 12 student? The paperwork alone took 4 months. The psychological evaluations took another 3. We needed approval from 6 different committees." "Okay," Fletcher said slowly. "She's here because she's the most stable candidate Earth could provide," the administrator continued. "The calmest, the most controlled, the least likely to trigger interspecies incidents." They gestured at their screen. "And in one demonstration, you made her smile." "That seems like a good thing," Fletcher tried. "She hasn't smiled since arriving," the administrator said. "Not once. Do you understand what that means? She's been bored. For 2 months, we've been boring a Deathworlder, which is exactly what we wanted, and you just made her interested." Fletcher felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I didn't mean to." "I know," the administrator said. which somehow makes it worse. They pulled up another screen. I'm suspending the conflict resolution class for the rest of the week. Cultural sensitivity review. Mandatory for you and all students. That seems excessive, Fletcher said. You accidentally issued a combat challenge to a Valorkai warrior caste in front of a human from a Class 12 Deathworld, the administrator said flatly. Excessive would be evacuating this entire section. This is measured response. They paused. Also, Krelvor is in medical bay. Anxiety-induced fainting. The medic says he'll be fine, but you might want to visit. Fletcher left the office feeling like he'd just been called to the principal for something he didn't entirely understand, but was definitely his fault. The station medical bay was quiet when Fletcher arrived. All clean white surfaces and softly humming equipment. A medic directed him to a bed in the corner where Krelvor lay, with both arms folded across his chest, his bronze fur slowly fading back to its normal color. His tail hung limply off the side of the bed. "Hey," Fletcher said awkwardly, standing at the foot of the bed. "How are you feeling?" Krelvor's amber eyes opened. Both pupils dilated immediately, and Fletcher watched orange flush through his shoulder fur before the Valorkai visibly controlled himself. "I shamed my family line," Krelvor said miserably. "I fainted. Warriors do not faint." "Warriors probably don't take Conflict Resolution 101 either," Fletcher pointed out. "This is a civilian academy." "My clutchmates will mock me for generations," Krelvor continued, ignoring him. "I challenged an armed Deathworlder with only my grip strength and survival instinct." He paused. Poor survival instinct. Obviously poor, because good survival instinct would have said, "Do not volunteer for demonstrations when Deathworlders are present." "I'm not a Deathworlder," Fletcher said. "I'm from a station. We have hydroponics and recycling systems. The most dangerous thing there is that weird fungus that grew in Section C that one time." "You moved like warrior," Krelvor said, stubbornly. "Drew blade while restrained. This is advanced technique." "It was an accident." "Tamsin did not think was accident," Krelvor said. "Tamsin thought was very good. I saw her face." Fletcher couldn't argue with that. He'd seen her face too. "Look," he said. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. The demonstration went wrong, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Krelvor's tail twitched. "Next class," he said carefully. "If there is demonstration, I will not volunteer." "Probably smart," Fletcher agreed. "And I will sit in back row." "Sure." "Behind structural support column," Krelvor added, "where Deathworlder cannot see me." "Tamsin's not going to hurt you," Fletcher said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "Class 12, Krelvor said, like it explained everything. And maybe it did. Fletcher left medical bay with the uncomfortable realization that his reputation had somehow shifted from boring teacher who assigns too much reading to guy who accidentally demonstrated combat readiness to a Deathworlder. This was not an improvement. He found Tamsin exactly where she'd said she'd be, the station gym, slot 7A-C. Through the observation window, Fletcher could see her moving through what looked like a training routine. No weapons, no equipment. Just movement. Smooth, controlled, and unsettlingly precise. He stood there for a moment, watching, wondering if he should interrupt. Wondering if walking into a room where a Class 12 Deathworlder was practicing combat techniques counted as the worst decision he'd made today, or just the continuation of an already terrible trend. The door slid open before he could decide. Tamsin stood on the other side, barely breathing hard, her academy uniform somehow still perfectly arranged. "Instructor Fletcher," she said, and that small smile flickered again. "Come to take me up on the training offer?" "No," Fletcher said. "I came to ask you a question." "Dokshim, right." She stepped aside, gesturing him into the gym. It was empty except for them, the padded floors and mirrored walls reflecting their conversation back at them. "Why did you smile?" Fletcher asked. "In class, when I pulled the knife." "Why?" Tamsin considered the question, her head tilting in that characteristic way. "Because it was real," she said finally. "Everything here is very safe, very controlled. Everyone's very careful. But for just a moment, you moved like you were actually in danger, even though you weren't. And that was..." She paused, searching for the word. "Familiar." "I'm from a station," Fletcher said. "Nothing dangerous has ever happened to me." "I know," Tamsin said. "That's what made it interesting. Muscle memory from somewhere. Training you don't remember. Or instinct you didn't know you had." She shrugged. "Most people here don't have any of that. They've never needed it." "And you wanted to see more of it," Fletcher said slowly. "I wanted to understand it," Tamsin corrected. "There's a difference." She moved to the center of the gym, gesturing at the space around them. "This place is very safe." "That's good. That's why I'm here. To learn how to exist in safe places. But sometimes safe is just quiet. Too quiet." Fletcher thought about her file, the boring, deliberately boring file that had taken months of evaluations to produce. "You miss Earth," he said. "No," Tamsin said immediately. Then softer. "Maybe. Parts of it. Not the dangerous parts. Just the honest parts. Where things are what they are, and you don't have to pretend everything's fine when someone pulls a knife." "It was rubber," Fletcher said, "but there was no heat in it anymore." "Still a knife," Tamsin said. "Still made Krelvor's fur turn colors. Still made the class evacuate. Still real, even if it was safe." They stood there in the empty gym, the mirrors reflecting their conversation in infinite regression. Fletcher thought about his boring class, his boring lectures, his boring life on a boring station where nothing ever happened, and everyone was perfectly, carefully safe. "Next class," he said finally. "You can sit in the front row, but no volunteering for demonstrations." "Agreed," Tamsin said. "And no smiling when other students panic." "That seems unreasonable," Tamsin said, but she was smiling now, and this time it reached her eyes. "Also non-negotiable." "Understood, instructor." Fletcher turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'm not whatever you think I am. Just a teacher who made a mistake." "Maybe," Tamsin said. "Or maybe safe places make everyone forget what they're capable of. Even boring people from boring stations." Fletcher didn't have an answer for that, so he left. The next class session, Tamsin sat in the front row. Krelvor sat in the back, behind a structural support column, with his fur carefully maintained at a calm bronze. The rest of the students filed in quietly, eyeing Fletcher, with a mixture of wariness and fascination. "Today," Fletcher announced, standing very deliberately in the center of the room with both hands visible and empty, "we'll be discussing de-escalation through verbal communication only. No demonstrations, no physical contact, just talking." It was, by every objective measure, the most boring class he'd ever taught. Tamsin took notes with perfect attention and didn't smile once, which Fletcher decided to count as a victory. After class, as students filed out, Krelvor approached his desk. His tail swished nervously. "Instructor," he said formally, I wish to apologize for fainting, was not appropriate response. No apology necessary, Fletcher said. I'm the one who messed up. Perhaps, Krelvor said, but also was educational. I learned cultural difference. Humans keep weapons in pockets. Valorkai keep weapons in designated holsters. This is important information for future non-conflict. I don't usually keep weapons in my pockets, Fletcher said tiredly. Understood, Krelvor said, in a tone that suggested he understood no such thing. We'll maintain respectful distance regardless. He left. Tamsin was the last one out, pausing at the door. Boring class today, instructor, she said. That was the goal, Fletcher replied. Achieved, Tamsin confirmed. Then quieter. Same time next week? That's how schedules work, yes? Good, she said, and left. Fletcher sat alone in his classroom, surrounded by empty desks and holographic displays of people having peaceful disagreements. His data tablet pinged with the formal incident report from the administrator's office, flagged for his review and signature. He signed it, filed it, and pulled out next week's lesson plan. Verbal De-Escalation Part 2. Words that don't accidentally start wars, he typed. It was going to be a very boring semester. Exactly as planned.